Well, now all the pieces have come together. Do you remember how the Iranians were hysterically shouting that Ukraine attacked Iranian merchant ships in the Caspian Sea in July, and even demanded compensation for them? So, today it became known that it is along this very route in the Caspian Sea that Russia is actively supplying weapons to Iran for the war with the United States. NBC News, citing a document from one of the European governments, reveals that Russia is supplying Iran with explosives, drone components and ammunition specifically through the Caspian Sea. With this, Tehran is trying to restore its military arsenal that was destroyed by strikes from the United States and Israel. And here is what's interesting. Literally a month before this NBC News publication, Ukrainian long-range drones had already struck ships along this very same route through the Caspian Sea that were transporting military cargo between Iran and Russia. Even back then, Ukraine was subtly hinting to Donald Trump that it could take responsibility for this section of the front, but Trump still keeps insisting that he believes Vladimir Putin, who promised him that under no circumstances would he help Iran. So, let's break down the whole chain, including how Trump, let me remind you, personally thanked Vladimir Putin for his neutrality on the Iran issue back in June. My name is Alexey Pechiy, let's dive into this topic, but before we start, please subscribe to this channel. We are moving towards the 300,000 subscriber mark, so I'll be grateful for every subscription. So, let's start with the actual scheme of arms supplies from Russia to Iran. According to a European government document confirmed by Western officials, Russia transports explosives, ammunition and drone parts across the Caspian Sea. These are materials Iran needs to restore its military capabilities after fighting against the US and Israel. Why was the Caspian route chosen? The logic here is extremely cynical. At the same time, it's actually quite obvious. The Caspian Sea is under the exclusive jurisdiction of only 5 countries: Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. That's all. US warships or those of its allies simply have no legal access there. That's it, there are no international waters there, it's purely the jurisdiction of those 5 countries. Cargo ships can freely turn off their transponders there, this AIS identification system, and the route itself completely bypasses all narrow sea straits which are controlled by Washington or its allies. So it is physically impossible for Western navies to intercept these shipments. The point is, it's kind of private sea for Iran and Russia, which no one controls in any way, because only those who have access to it know what's happening there. The motives of the Kremlin in these shipments go far beyond simple allied loyalty. No, this is pure self-interest. Every Iranian drone that strikes American targets in the Persian Gulf diverts US attention and military resources from the war in Ukraine. And replenishing the arsenals allows Tehran to continue supplying weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon and pro-Iranian groups in Iraq, Syria and Yemen. And this, as you can imagine, complicates the situation. For the US in the Middle East, it traditionally reduces the amount of aid that Washington can send to Kiev. But this is a kind of chain reaction. That is, okay, not only to Kiev, but also to the Europeans. Accordingly, the Europeans cannot transfer their Patriot missiles to us, because they understand that it will be impossible to make up for the shortage later, because the Americans themselves have a shortage. So, in other words, with a single weapon supply route, Moscow is striking on 2 fronts at once. And, unfortunately, this is having an effect, because Trump really stopped the supply of Patriot missiles to Ukraine, specifically after he used 2/3 of America's stockpile of these missiles in the Middle East. By the way, he still didn't achieve his goals. Meanwhile, Iran continues to strike American bases with that very same weapon. And since the beginning of the hostilities, at least 18 American soldiers have been killed in the region. I'm not even mentioning the financial losses. And here is what NBC News notes. This deepening of the strategic alliance between Moscow and Tehran looks like a mirror image of the first years of the full-scale war against Ukraine. when it was the other way around and Iran was helping Russia. Iran supplied not only ready-made Shahed strike drones, but also the very technology for their production, which Moscow later modernized and launched into mass domestic production. There is also a more serious form of assistance, the kind of support the Financial Times mentions. Russia provided Iran not only with actual weapons, but also with satellite images, intelligence data and information for striking US positions in the Middle East. So basically, Russia gave Iran everything it needed to carry out continuous strikes against Americans in the region. That means satellite images, intelligence data, clear information on where to strike, and even provided the means to strike. In fact, at one point there was an attempt to break this supply chain by force. Let me remind you, at the end of March, Israel struck the Iranian port complex of Bandar Anzali on that very Caspian coast, and according to the Israeli side, it was specifically used for the transit of weapons from Russia. But, as it became known later, shipments resumed after that, and now, almost 6 months later, deliveries are going on again, apparently without any serious interruptions at all. And Israel and the US have for some reason stopped even paying attention to this altogether. And all because Trump, it seems to me, stubbornly refuses to see this cooperation between Moscow and Tehran. Of course, it's only fair to make an honest disclaimer here, without which the picture would still be incomplete. American officials refrain from publicly assessing how effectively these supplies from Russia actually compensate for Iran's losses. And Western intelligence agencies openly admit that a full assessment of the damage done to Iran's military infrastructure is also still ongoing. So we have confirmation of the arms supply route from Russia to Iran. But there is still no clear answer as to how much it actually helps Tehran restore its combat capability. It's extremely important to note the time context in which all this is happening. Back in mid-June, the United States of America and Iran, let me remind you, concluded a 60-day truce, which in August, on the 18th, was supposedly extended for another 2 months. But according to the Wall Street Journal, the Iranian authorities decided to use this pause in hostilities specifically to prepare for a new phase of the war and to replenish their arsenals. Tehran's goal, according to the publication, is to inflict such damage on the US and Israel that it will forever prevent a repeat of massive strikes on Iranian territory, like last year's 12-day war and the current conflict. It turns out that Russian supplies of explosives and drone components are coming in exactly those months when Iran, according to intelligence, uses them for military preparations, not for actual peaceful purposes. In other words, this is not a one-time aid. This is a systematic build-up of a site that is simultaneously preparing to expand military operations. And now the most interesting part. Kiev also tried to strike exactly at this supply route between Moscow and Tehran, and more than once. Let me remind you, on the night of June 25, the Security Service of Ukraine carried out strikes with long-range drones on targets in the Caspian region. At that time, 3 vessels were hit, 2 of which are directly linked to arms supplies from Iran, as well as an oil production platform at the Filanovsky field. Separately, at that time, a missile boat of Project 124-18 Molnia from the Russian fleet was also hit. And on July 25, Zelensky personally confirmed a new strike in the same region. Here is his quote. There are also very good results from long-range strikes in the Caspian Sea area. In particular, vessels involved in transporting military cargo between Russia and Iran were hit, as well as a warship. And according to the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, one of the vessels that was hit, a Pechiy, was transporting military cargo from Iran to Russia. According to intelligence, there were cartridges and shells on board, and the port where it was based was considered a key target for the attack. And it was a logistics hub of the North-South International Transport Corridor, intended for trade with sanctioned Iran. Tehran's reaction to this attack was furious. By the way, this shows that they hit something very important. Let me remind you, Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that during the strike on the merchant ship, a sailor was killed and another was wounded, calling the attack a violation of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. The head of Iran's foreign ministry, Abbas Araghchi, stated that this is a blatant violation of the UN Charter, carried out at the behest of Israel in order to drag Europe into its war. And as you remember, Iran even allegedly planned to launch a missile strike on Ukraine. But then, the foreign ministers of Iran and Ukraine had a phone call, and allegedly, as Iran stated, the Ukrainians said that the strike was accidental. So Tehran publicly insisted that the vessel was civilian, and that the strike on the Caspian Sea was not organized by Ukraine independently, but under someone else's direction. Although the Ukrainian side directly stated that there were military cargoes on board. And here is the final touch that makes this whole story truly illustrative. Compare this with what Donald Trump publicly said back in June. Speaking to journalists, he said, and I quote, "I want to thank China and Chairman Xi Jinping. I met with him, and he maintained neutrality, complete neutrality, and I appreciate that. And I also want to thank Vladimir Putin for..." maintaining a neutral position regarding Iran. According to him, in the spring of 2026, he personally appealed to Beijing and Moscow, asking them not to sell weapons to Iran under any circumstances. And by his own assessment at the time, both Putin and Xi Jinping fulfilled his request and said, "Okay, Donald Trump, absolutely not." And here is the situation where Trump in June directly expresses his gratitude. He says outright, "I thank Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping for not helping Iran." It is telling that even then, Donald Trump himself was not entirely consistent, because in other public statements from the same period, he admitted that Putin, as he put it, helps Iran a little. So even back then he already had, well, let's say certain suspicions. But he preferred to publicly thank Moscow for its neutrality. I don't know, to me that's a disgrace. That's my subjective opinion. But it's a disgrace when the American president, in the middle of a war, thanks some bold, unwashed Putin, knowing that he's still helping Tehran. Well now, almost 2 months after that expression of gratitude, NBC News, based on a European government document, clearly shows there was no neutrality at all. All this time, Russia was supplying Iran with explosives, ammunition, drone components, and even intelligence on the route, which is physically not under the control of either the US or their allies. But it is accessible to Ukraine, and Ukraine was ready to strike this route, and even did strike it. But Trump apparently did not support this idea and kept thanking Vladimir Putin in his head for supposedly not helping Iran. And something tells me that even in this situation, even when everything is already out in the open, Trump will again say that he trusts the Russian dictator more than his own or European intelligence. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.